In 1734, British Captain Stoddard stood at the base of one of the highest mountains in Jamaica, staring up at a nearly vertical path barely wide enough for one person to pass. His orders were clear: destroy Nanny Town. Kill everyone inside. When he finally reached the summit hours later and saw what remained of the Maroon settlement, he reported back to his superiors that all the rebels had been eliminated. He was wrong. The woman they called Nanny was still alive, and she wasn't finished fighting. This is the story of how a woman born into slavery in West Africa became the only female among Jamaica's national heroes, how she led a guerrilla war that brought the British Empire to its knees, and how the peace she eventually accepted transformed her from liberator to enforcer of the very system she had spent decades resisting. What we know about Nanny comes mostly from oral history, which makes separating the historical figure from the legend challenging. The British colonial records mention her only a handful of times, usually in derogatory terms. But those few mentions, combined with the land patents, treaty documents, and the testimony of the Maroon communities themselves, give us enough to piece together the arc of her life. She was born around 1686 in what is now Ghana, likely among the Asante or Akan people. According to Maroon oral history, her mother's name was Nyankopong, which suggests she may have been connected to the Asante ruling class. The name Nanny itself, properly Nanani in Akan, means ancestress and mother. Sometime around the turn of the 18th century, she was captured and survived the Middle Passage to Jamaica. Whether she was sold into slavery or came as a free woman who later chose to join the Maroons remains unclear. The Maroon communities themselves tell different versions of her arrival. In one story, she escaped from a slave ship, possibly jumping overboard before it even reached shore. In another, she came as a free woman of royal blood. What seems certain is that by the early 1700s, she had made her way into the Blue Mountains of eastern Jamaica, joining or helping to establish what would become known as the Windward Maroons. The Maroons weren't a single unified group. They were communities of people who had freed themselves from slavery, some going back to the Spanish period before the British took Jamaica in 1655. When the Spanish fled the British invasion, many of the Africans they had enslaved escaped into the mountains rather than submit to new masters. Over the following decades, they were joined by others who freed themselves from British plantations. By the early 18th century, Jamaica had two main Maroon populations. The Leeward Maroons occupied the cockpit country in the western part of the island. The Windward Maroons, Nanny's people, claimed the Blue Mountains in the east. By 1720, Nanny had emerged as the leader of the Windward Maroons, and the settlement under her command became known as Nanny Town. The location was strategically brilliant. Built on a ridge in the Stony River Valley, 2,000 feet above sea level, the town could only be accessed by narrow, treacherous paths. Guards posted at lookout points could see anyone approaching from miles away. The surrounding terrain was a fortress of steep slopes, dense jungle, and fast-flowing rivers that the Maroons knew intimately, and the British found nearly impassable. Nanny Town wasn't just a military outpost. At its height, it had over 140 houses, making it one of the largest Maroon settlements in Jamaica. The Maroons survived by trading with nearby market towns, exchanging food for weapons, cloth, and other necessities. They also raided plantations, liberating enslaved people, seizing supplies, and burning estates. These raids served multiple purposes. They weakened the plantation system, gathered resources for the Maroon communities, and sent a message that the mountains offered an alternative to slavery. The British knew about Nanny Town, but knowing about it and reaching it were two different things. It wasn't until 1728 that an African man named Sambo led British forces to the settlement. That year marked the beginning of what would become known as the First Maroon War, though in truth there had been periodic conflicts between the Maroons and the British for decades. What changed in 1728 was the scale and intensity of the British response. In September of that year, they sent additional troops to Jamaica and appointed a new governor, Major General Robert Hunter, with explicit orders to end the Maroon threat once and for all. Nanny's military tactics became legendary, even among her enemies. She trained her warriors in guerrilla warfare techniques that bewildered British soldiers accustomed to European-style battles. The Maroons would cover themselves in branches and leaves, standing so still they looked like trees until British troops passed, then attacking from behind. They used decoys with a few Maroons running out into British view before leading the soldiers directly into ambushes where hidden warriors waited. They blew conch shells and horns called abengs, creating the acoustic illusion of a much larger force. The sound of these horns echoing through the mountains terrorized British soldiers and communicated complex tactical information across vast distances. The Maroons also employed psychological warfare. They would call out to enslaved Africans serving in the British militia, urging them to desert and join the free communities in the mountains. This wasn't just propaganda. It worked often enough that the British constantly worried about their black auxiliary forces switching sides. The Maroons understood something the British were slow to grasp. This wasn't a conventional war between two armies. It was a war of attrition where the side that could endure longest would win. British records from this period capture their mounting frustration. In 1730, Lieutenant Soper led a large force against the Windward Maroons. Nanny and her commanders, including a man named Quao, and captains like Jeddo and Welcome, defeated them decisively. The following year, 2 additional British regiments arrived in Jamaica. In 1732, Governor Hunter sent 3 separate parties against Nanny Town. One party managed to occupy the settlement, but the occupation proved so expensive and difficult to maintain that Hunter eventually recalled his forces. The moment the British withdrew, the Maroons simply walked back into their town and resumed their lives. The pattern repeated throughout the early 1730s. The British would launch an expedition, suffer heavy casualties reaching the mountains, occupy Nanny Town temporarily if they reached it at all, then withdraw when maintaining their position became unsustainable. The Maroons would fade into the jungle during British attacks, then return when the coast was clear. One documented British account from November 1731 describes an expedition led by Captain de la Millière. After days of marching over steep rocks and through deep, fast rivers, the British force was ambushed and routed. De la Millière's report makes clear that his men were completely outmatched by Maroon tactics and knowledge of the terrain. In 1734, Captain Stoddard led what appeared to be a more successful assault. He reached Nanny Town and destroyed much of it, reporting that all the Maroons had been killed. This claim was either deliberate misinformation or wishful thinking. Many Maroons survived, including Nanny herself. The survivors moved to a place called Catawoods in the John Crow Mountains and continued their resistance. Later that year, a group of Windward Maroons conquered an estate in St. George Parish, taking a fort and barracks. In retaliation for the destruction of Nanny Town, Windward warriors launched assaults on Titchfield Fort in Port Antonio. The First Maroon War was bleeding Jamaica white, By the end of 1734, the island's white population had fallen to about 2,000 people. Sugar exports, the colony's economic lifeblood, had declined significantly. The colony went through periods of martial law. Governor Hunter died in 1734, his mission to defeat the Maroons unfulfilled. His successors fared no better. The British were learning what many colonial powers would learn in the centuries to come. A technologically superior military force can be defeated by determined guerrilla fighters with intimate knowledge of their home terrain. By 1739, the British faced a reality they found humiliating to accept. They could not defeat the Maroons militarily. A contemporary military source observed that all the regular troops in Europe could not have conquered the Jamaican Maroons, and that if the Maroons had not been granted liberty, they would in all probability have become masters of the whole island. The comment reflected less the actual military balance than the British perception of how badly the war was going. The man who finally brokered peace was Governor Edward Trelawney, who replaced Hunter's successors and recognized that continuing the war was futile. In March 1739, a planter and militia officer named John Guthrie signed a treaty with Cudjoe, the leader of the Leeward Maroons. The treaty recognized the Leeward Maroons as a semi-autonomous entity, granted them 1,500 acres of land, and promised them freedom and limited political autonomy. In exchange, the Maroons agreed to several conditions that would fundamentally alter their relationship with the enslaved population of Jamaica. The Windward Maroons, under Nanny and Quow, held out for another year. They reportedly disagreed with the principle of making peace with the British at all, but pressure came from multiple directions. White Jamaicans wanted the war ended. The Leeward Maroons, having already signed their treaty, urged the Windward Maroons to do the same, and the British made clear that the alternative to treaty was continued warfare, now potentially with the Leeward Maroons fighting alongside British forces against the Windward communities. On April 20th, 1740, the Windward Maroons signed their treaty. The terms were similar to those granted the Leeward Maroons, but with one crucial difference. The Windward Treaty initially made no specific mention of land allocation for Crawford's Town, where some of the Windward Maroons would settle under Quow's leadership. This led to ongoing disputes between planters and the Crawford's Town Maroons over the following years. Nanny received a separate land grant. On August 5, 1740, King George II issued letters patent granting unto Nanny, described as a free Negro, and the people under her command and their heirs and assigns forever, a parcel of land containing 500 acres in Portland Parish. The land was bounded on 3 sides by Crown land, and on the west by the property of a Mr. John Stevenson. This land became New Nanny Town, later renamed Moortown, possibly in honor of Governor Sir Henry Moore. The treaty ended the war, but it came with a price that has haunted Maroon history ever since. The Maroons agreed to cease all hostilities forever. They received their freedom and their land. They could hunt where they wished, except within 3 miles of any settlement. They maintained their own governance structures, with Maroon leaders succeeded by men of their choosing, subject to eventual governor approval. But in exchange, they agreed to use their best endeavors to take, kill, suppress, or destroy all rebels throughout the island. They agreed that if any enslaved person ran away from their master and fell into Maroon hands, that person would immediately be returned to the chief magistrate of the nearest parish. The Maroons who brought them back would receive compensation for their trouble. They agreed to help defend Jamaica if the island was invaded by a foreign enemy. the treaty transformed the Maroons from liberators of the enslaved to enforcers of slavery. The very people who had freed themselves, who had built communities where freedom was possible, now became obligated to return others to bondage. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The bridge between the freedom fighters and the enslaved, which had allowed Maroon communities to grow with each successful escape, was destroyed by the treaty's terms. No longer would people fleeing slavery find automatic sanctuary in the mountains. Instead, they might find themselves captured by the very people they had hoped would protect them. The impact of this arrangement became clear in the decades following the treaty. In the 1750s, to generate revenue and prevent land-hungry planters from encroaching on their territory, both leeward and windward Maroons became paid slave catchers. By the time of Tacky's Rebellion in 1760, one of Jamaica's largest slave uprisings, Maroon forces helped the British suppress the revolt. They played similar roles in subsequent rebellions, including Jamaica's largest slave uprising on the eve of emancipation in 1832 and the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion. Their assistance was often the deciding factor in British victories. The colonial government, vastly outnumbered by the enslaved population, relied on Maroon military support to maintain control. Nanny herself lived to see the early years of this new arrangement. She died around 1750, or perhaps as late as 1760, the exact date uncertain like so much else about her life. By some accounts, she disagreed with Quao over the treaty and parted ways with him. While Quao took some followers to central Jamaica to establish what would become Crawfordstown, Nanny led her people to the 500 acres in Portland Parish that became Moortown. The town she founded still exists, one of 4 remaining Maroon settlements in Jamaica. She was buried at a place called Bump Grave in Moortown, though the exact location of her burial site has become a matter of some dispute over the centuries. A monument marks what is believed to be her grave today. The community celebrates her memory every October on Jamaican National Heroes Day. In 1975, the government of Jamaica named Nanny a national hero, the only woman to receive this honor. Her face appears on the $500 Jamaican note, which people colloquially call a nanny. What makes Nanny's legacy complicated isn't the legends that grew around her, though those are considerable. Maroon oral tradition credits her with supernatural powers. She supposedly possessed obeah, described by the British as witchcraft, but understood by the Maroons as a combination of spiritual wisdom and practical knowledge rooted in West African traditions. Later, colonial writers, particularly Thomas's 1890 book Untrodden Jamaica, added more salacious details, including the infamous story that Nanny could catch and fire bullets with her buttocks. This tale has been repeated in countless retellings, much to the frustration of serious historians. Scholar Kamau Brathwaite suggested that while similar feats were reported in African military contexts, the specific focus on that part of Nanny's anatomy was an attempt by colonial writers to vulgarize and denigrate her power. By reducing her to a single sensational detail, the colonizers avoided confronting the full scope of her achievements. What makes Nanny's legacy complicated is the treaty itself, and what it reveals about the impossible choices faced by people fighting for freedom in a world built on slavery. From one perspective, the treaty was a victory. The Maroons forced the British Empire to recognize their freedom and autonomy. They secured land that they and their descendants could call their own. They preserved their communities and cultures in a way that almost no other group of formerly enslaved people managed in the Americas during that period. The very existence of Moortown today more than 280 years after the treaty, testifies to what they achieved. From another perspective, the treaty represented a devil's bargain that betrayed the cause of universal freedom. The Maroons saved themselves at the cost of becoming instruments of slavery's enforcement. They built a wall between their own freedom and the freedom of others. They accepted that some people deserved liberty while others did not, and they agreed to use violence to maintain that distinction. The freedom they won was real, but it was limited and conditional in ways that compromised its moral foundation. Understanding Nanny means holding both these perspectives simultaneously. She was a military genius who used guerrilla tactics to defeat a vastly superior military force. She was a political leader who maintained the unity and morale of her community through years of warfare. She was a spiritual figure whose presence inspired confidence and courage in her followers. She secured freedom and land for her people when most enslaved Africans in the Americas had neither. And she did all this as a woman in a world that granted women, particularly African women, virtually no formal authority or recognition. She was also a participant in a system that perpetuated slavery. Whether she had a choice in that participation is debatable. The British made clear that the alternative to treaty was annihilation, if not immediately, then eventually. The Maroons could fight to the death for a principle or secure survival for their children. Nanny chose survival. That choice preserved Maroon communities, but foreclosed the possibility of those communities serving as a continuous refuge for people seeking freedom. The broader historical context helps explain why the British sued for peace when they did. By the late 1730s, Maroon raids had made the interior of Jamaica effectively ungovernable. Planters couldn't expand their operations without facing constant attacks. The cost of military campaigns against the Maroons was bankrupting the colony. The example of Maroon freedom undermined slavery's ideological foundation. If Africans could defeat British forces and create their own free societies, then the racist justifications for slavery lost credibility. Better to make peace with a few thousand Maroons and convert them into enforcers of slavery than to let them remain as an inspiration to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. The treaty's terms reflected this calculation. The British gave up very little, 500 acres in mountainous terrain that planters weren't using anyway. Recognition of freedom for people who already were free and whom the British couldn't recapture. In exchange, they gained military allies who knew the terrain intimately and could track runaway slaves more effectively than any British soldier. They transformed a threat to slavery into a pillar supporting it. From the British perspective, it was a masterpiece of colonial policy. The Maroons lived with the consequences of that policy for generations. They maintained their autonomy and their distinct culture. They kept alive traditions from West Africa that disappeared in most other parts of the African diaspora. They passed down oral histories that preserved Nanny's memory when British records tried to erase or diminish her. They remained a people apart, neither fully integrated into Jamaican society nor entirely separate from it. The Asofo councils, named after the Akan word for assembly, governed their towns according to their own customs. They spoke their own language, a Creole that mixed West African languages with English. They practiced their own spiritual traditions, even as many converted to Christianity. They were Maroons first and Jamaicans second, an identity that persists to this day. That separate identity came at a cost. The treaty created lasting tensions between Maroons and other Jamaicans of African descent. The requirement to return runaway slaves and suppress rebellions put Maroons at odds with people who had been or remained enslaved. Those conflicts shaped Jamaican history in profound ways. When enslaved people rose up, they couldn't count on Maroon support. When Maroons interacted with broader Jamaican society, they carried the weight of that historical betrayal. Some Maroons eventually returned escaped slaves reluctantly, with quiet understanding that allowed many to escape anyway. Others took their obligations seriously and became ruthless slave catchers. The historical record documents both tendencies. In 1781, recognizing that 500 acres wasn't enough to sustain the growing Moortown community, the Maroons requested and received an additional 1,270 acres of land. The Assembly agreed to purchase this land from a neighboring planter named Charles Douglas, bringing Moortown's total land to about 1,800 acres. This expansion happened after Nanny's death, but reflected her original vision of a self-sufficient Maroon community with enough land to sustain itself through farming and hunting. The question of what Nanny herself thought about the treaty and its compromises can't be definitively answered. The British records that mention her at all describe her in hostile terms as the rebels' old Obeah woman. The Maroon oral traditions celebrate her as a cultural hero and ancestress, but don't dwell on the moral complexities of the peace settlement. We know she lived for at least a decade after the treaty and led her people to Moortown. We know the community she founded survived. Beyond that, we can only speculate about her inner life, her doubts if she had any, her justifications to herself for the choices she made. What we can say is that Nanny understood power and how to wield it effectively in constrained circumstances. She understood that absolute victory was impossible, but that survival was achievable. She understood that the freedom of her people, even compromised freedom, was worth fighting for and worth preserving through negotiation when fighting could no longer accomplish that goal. She understood that leading meant making terrible choices and living with the consequences of those choices. The history of marronage across the Americas follows similar patterns. From Brazil to Suriname to the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, communities of people who freed themselves from slavery faced the same dilemmas. Some maintained their independence through geography and military resistance. Others made accommodations with colonial authorities. Almost all eventually found themselves in some form of compromise with the systems they had escaped. The Maroons of Jamaica were unusual primarily in the scale of their success and the formality of their treaty arrangements, not in the basic dynamics they confronted. Nanny's story also illuminates something important about how we remember resistance to slavery. The tendency in popular history is to lionize rebels and runaways without examining the complexity of their situations. We want our heroes uncomplicated, our resistance movements pure in motivation and consistent in practice. But real resistance happens in a world of impossible choices, limited options, and moral ambiguity. Real people make pragmatic decisions that may betray their principles because the alternative is death or annihilation of their communities. Acknowledging that complexity doesn't diminish Nanny's achievement. If anything, it makes what she accomplished more remarkable because it shows she succeeded not in some idealized revolutionary scenario, but in the messy, constrained reality of 18th century Jamaica. The influence of Nanny and the Maroons extended beyond Jamaica's shores in ways that shaped Caribbean and Atlantic history. In 1977, when Toussaint Louverture was leading the Haitian Revolution, He explicitly referenced the Jamaican Maroons as inspiration. He reportedly said that in Jamaica there were blacks in the mountains who had forced the English to make treaties with them, and that he knew how to make war the same way. The success of the Maroon resistance demonstrated to enslaved people throughout the Caribbean that fighting back was possible, that creating free communities was achievable, that colonial powers could be forced to negotiate. This psychological impact may have been more significant than any direct military influence. The specific military tactics that Nanny developed or perfected were studied and adapted by resistance movements for generations. The use of terrain as a force multiplier, the employment of ambushes and psychological warfare, the creation of false trails and decoys, the integration of local knowledge into military strategy, all became standard elements of guerrilla warfare that appeared in independence movements from Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia. Nanny wasn't the only person to use these tactics, but she was among the most successful practitioners in the 18th century Atlantic world, and her success was noticed. The preservation of African cultural practices in Maroon communities also had lasting significance. When scholars and cultural historians study the African diaspora, they often struggle with the fact that slavery systematically destroyed African cultures and replaced them with syncretic Caribbean or American cultures. The Maroon communities, because of their isolation and autonomy, preserved more direct links to West African traditions than almost any other communities in the Americas. The language, music, spiritual practices, social organization, and material culture of the Maroons became invaluable resources for understanding what had been lost elsewhere. Nanny's decision to establish a permanent settlement rather than remain perpetually on the move created the conditions for this cultural preservation. The relationship between Nanny and the male Maroon leaders who appear in the historical record alongside her raises questions about gender and power in Maroon society. The sources refer to several male leaders, including Cudjoe, Akompong, Quao, and captains like Jeddo and Welcome. Some oral traditions describe these men as Nanny's brothers, though whether this means biological brothers or brothers in arms remains unclear. What's notable is that Nanny appears to have commanded respect and authority equal to or exceeding that of her male counterparts. The British specifically identified her as a threat and targeted her settlement repeatedly. The land grant was issued in her name, not in the name of a male leader. This suggests that Maroon society, unlike both British colonial society and many enslaved communities, recognized female leadership in ways that seem remarkable for the period. The spiritual dimension of Nanny's leadership deserves more attention than it often receives. Her identification as an Obeah woman wasn't just British slander. The Maroons themselves credited her with spiritual power and wisdom. In West African societies, spiritual leaders often wielded significant political and military authority, and this tradition appears to have continued in Maroon communities. Nanny's role combined military leadership, political decision-making, and spiritual guidance in ways that would have been familiar to African societies, but were incomprehensible to European observers who separated these domains. Her ability to inspire confidence in her followers may have had as much to do with her spiritual authority as her military skills. The documentation that survives from the treaty negotiations reveals British attitudes toward Nanny specifically and toward African resistance more generally. They refused to use titles of respect when referring to her, calling her simply Nanny, rather than acknowledging any formal leadership position. They emphasized the need to end her raids and bring her people under control. They expressed relief when the treaty was signed, and the windward Maroons ceased their resistance. But underneath this dismissive rhetoric, there's clear evidence that the British recognized Nanny as a formidable opponent, whom they couldn't defeat militarily. The fact that they negotiated at all, that they granted land and autonomy, that they formalized these arrangements in legal documents, all testifies to the respect they wouldn't articulate but clearly felt. In the final analysis, Nanny's story resists simple categorization. She was neither a pure freedom fighter nor a simple collaborator, neither a legendary superhero nor an ordinary historical figure. She was a real woman who lived through extraordinary circumstances and made choices that shaped the lives of thousands of people across multiple generations. She fought for freedom and won it, but the freedom she won came with conditions that limited its scope and meaning. She preserved African culture and community in the New World, but within a framework that required those communities to help perpetuate the very system they had escaped. She became a hero to her people and eventually to Jamaica as a whole, but the actual historical Nanny was more complicated and more interesting than the heroic image suggests. The questions her life raises remain relevant. What does freedom mean if it requires complicity in the oppression of others? Can we celebrate victories that come with moral compromises? How do we honor people who made difficult choices in impossible situations without either condemning them for imperfection or sanitizing the consequences of their decisions? Nanny's legacy challenges us to think seriously about these questions rather than settling for easy answers. The 500 acres she secured for her people became the foundation of a community that outlasted slavery, outlasted British colonial rule, and survives into the 21st century. That community, imperfect as its founding compromise may have been, represents something that almost no other group of enslaved Africans in the Americas achieved: continuity with their past, preservation of their culture, and the ability to pass down their history in their own words through their own traditions. Nanny gave them that. It cost something to secure it, but she secured it nonetheless. How we judge that bargain says more about us and our own relationship to questions of freedom and resistance than it does about the woman herself, who made the best choices she could with the options available to her in a world that offered enslaved people no good choices at all.